We know Gearbox are working on Borderlands 4, but for it to be their best game to date, they need to learn from their previous games. And they can take a lot of learnings from Borderlands 3. I'll be covering all of the things they should have learned, including the lesson that Gearbox will never forget. So keep an eye out for that, and don't forget to drop a comment about where Borderlands 4 can be better than Borderlands 3. And let's crack into it. One of the biggest complaints at launch for Borderlands 3 was the main questline. Egotistical streamer twins as the villain, a weird old guy as their dad, talking to Lilith every 5 seconds, and a kid who lost their diary. It's like a Saturday night upstairs in the library. There wasn't enough there to keep players engaged, and there were numerous points in the plot where the narrative just didn't make sense, or you were left feeling underwhelmed. At the same time though, despite its incredibly mediocre story, Borderlands 3 drew you in with its gunplay. The gameplay was as smooth as it has ever been, and with a forgettable campaign, was enough to hold it together. If Borderlands 4 gets both of these things right, we're in for a treat. Early nerfs hurt, like when the barista is out of almond milk so you have to use oat. I don't know what that means, but they affect you, mentally. I'm not talking about nerfs to your gear or your Vault Hunter, but legendary drop rates too. A week after launch, Borderlands 3 saw sweeping changes to drop rates. They scaled down loot drops in Mayhem mode, nerfed Chupacabratch's legendary aura, and slowed down the spawn rate of loot tanks in the mansion. If you remember farming loot tanks or Chupacabratch at launch, then you're an OG, and you'll remember how you felt when these changes went live. The original meta was nerfed a little over a month after launch, and players weren't too happy about that either. Borderlands 3's launch was bumpy, but if Borderlands 4 is stable on release, both in terms of balancing and especially performance, then it'll be onwards and upwards from there. Borderlands 3, in my opinion, is the embodiment of farming done right, and we need that in Borderlands 4. Every piece of legendary loot has a dedicated target that has an increased chance to drop that specific item, and it's never usually more than a 10% chance, which is miles better than previous Borderlands games. Furthermore, to account for the sheer volume of legendaries, they released a patch that gave the ability for enemies tied to quests to respawn. They also made it so that rare spawn enemies weren't rare anymore and actually spawned every time. This helped spread out that loot like never before. It was glorious. I may have even cried. You don't give your dog one tummy tickle, do you? You give them many tummy tickles. Exactly my point. Borderlands 3 had 5 level cap increases to go from the starting cap of 50 to the current cap of 72, when previous Borderlands games would get there in 2 leaps. Each time the cap increased, you'd throw away all of your gear because it was no longer as good as it could be. It's an artificial way of adding content by forcing a new farming cycle on the player. I know for a fact that a lot of players did not enjoy the approach they took. A good suggestion I heard was to allow us to spend Iridium to level up our weapons, but that didn't happen. When there's no new gear to farm for, or the jump in levels doesn't give you enough skill points to make meaningful changes to your build, then it's hard to justify small increases to the level cap. Borderlands 3 went from 50 to 53, then to 57 and to 60, which didn't impact our builds much at all each time. In saying that, Borderlands 3 did do one thing right when it came to level caps, and that's by making them free to all players. That's definitely the way to go about it. It keeps everyone on an even playing field and eliminates the FOMO involved. Borderlands 4 should take a leaf out of the Borderlands 3 tree and continue their stance on free content drops. We got the Halloween event, the Maliwan takedown, the Valentine's Day event, the Cartel event, and the Guardian takedown, all without spending a pretty penny. That's 40 pieces of legendary gear to play with. To put that in perspective, Borderlands 1 has 50 A's in total. On top of that, we saw exclusive weapons added to Mayhem 4 and Mayhem 6, and the introduction of Mayhem 2.0, which we'll touch on a little later. At the end of the day, Borderlands 3 was supported better than any game in the franchise, and a lot of that support came free to all players. My hope is that Borderlands 4 gets the same, if not better support, and not whatever it was we got with Wonderlands. You would think that developers should know that we, as players, expect the hardest piece of content to offer up the best rewards, but that isn't always the case. The Maliwan takedown's loot went in and out of the meta, the Guardian takedown still doesn't reward players with good enough gear to warrant the struggle, and Hemovorus the Invincible really only offers up the Company Man as a worthwhile investment. When I think of the most OP gear in Borderlands 3 and where to farm it, there's one place that springs to mind: Arms Race. And that's not challenging, it's boring. The challenge is in staying awake. Am I right? Yeah, no, but seriously, something is definitely wrong here. My finger can smell it. Mayhem 2.0 nearly killed Borderlands 3. Enemies were too strong, modifiers were causing performance issues, only 5 weapons out of 150 were actually viable, and no one had them yet because they only just released. To have such a radical update release in the state it did at such an important time between DLC 2 and DLC 3 was crazy. It really was. The game could have been dead before Bounty of Blood came out. Just think about that. To their credit though, it didn't. They got there in the end. It took just 18 months of almost weekly buffs for pretty much every weapon to get its Mayhem 2.0 damage update. Sorry Crossroads. I know. Maybe one day. This is the biggest lesson that Gearbox themselves will take from Borderlands 3. They went about fixing things as soon as they could and acknowledged how the community felt about it. Very rarely have I ever seen a company do that. They presented us with a planned, phased approach on how they were going to fix things, identifying the issues they felt needed addressing and the steps that would be taken to solve them. Full credit for the way they handled the situation, but I'm sure they never want to go through something like that again. I expect Borderlands 4 to have a solid foundation for their endgame at launch to avoid a similar fiasco, and it'll be really interesting to see what they come up with. Another thing we learned from Borderlands 3, I think to many players' surprise, is that 4 Vault Hunters is enough. Gearbox CEO Randy Pitchford made it very clear prior to launch that there were only ever going to be 4 Vault Hunters, no 5th or 6th like we saw in Borderlands 2. It's as though they learned from that game too. So hey, there's hope for the things I'm presenting here. Launching with 4 Vault Hunters and adding a skill tree to each one instead of an entirely new character, I think worked really well. It narrowed the shared experience and elevated each Vault Hunter. They mattered more. I still wonder what a 5th Vault Hunter would look like in Borderlands 3, but I'm satisfied with how that all ended up. Moving on to something I think is extremely important to the genre as a whole, and that's build diversity. If there's one thing Borderlands 3 drives home, it's that providing players with the freedom to play how they want is a major factor in their enjoyment and a driving force towards the game's overall success. If you think about the build variety in Borderlands 3, the combination of gear, guns and skills that are viable for endgame, it is massive and gives the game a lot of staying power. In Borderlands 4, I want that again. Frankly, it needs it. Borderlands 3, regardless of how you feel about the story or the decisions they made along the way, it's always had a growing depth to its gameplay. It's the comfy cushion it can always fall back on. I hope the people at Gearbox realise just how important this is, and we see it again at the forefront of Borderlands 4. If nothing else, what Borderlands 3 taught us is that the traditional Season Pass content model still works. Games don't have to be live service to have longevity. You don't need a Battle Pass or a Rocket Pass to keep players engaged. Mind you, it did release 4.5 years ago, so things may have changed, but I don't see a reason why it wouldn't work for Borderlands 4. Speaking of Season Passes, Borderlands 3's second Season Pass was a unique culmination of content. Regardless of what you think of it, it proves that there is value in offering DLC beyond Season Pass 1. We received new skill trees, a fresh questline, standalone game mode, a raid boss, and a separate progression and unlock system through vault cards, which I think were a great way to pump life into the game. It's up to Gearbox to decide how long they want to support Borderlands 4 and what the timeframe is around any future releases. But I wouldn't be surprised if we get a fully featured Season Pass 2 in their next game. In this day and age, it's rare for a game not to have some kind of microtransactions, especially when it has a multiplayer component. Hey, even Dragon's Dogma 2, an exclusively single player game, has them. In the looter shooter genre, there are plenty of avenues for monetization. I mean, even just making Iridium purchasable would be a way to do it. Imagine that, essentially making the player pay to reroll anointments. That would be rough. I commend Borderlands 3 for taking a strong stance against their inclusion, and the game has proved that a 20-year-old studio can create their most successful game to date without a microtransaction to be seen. I don't see any reason why Gearbox would be prepared to take any backlash over microtransactions in Borderlands 4, especially considering how well Borderlands 3 did without them. Hopefully Gearbox can take all this on board to make the best game possible, and if I missed anything, drop it in the comments below.